Let's go ahead and start. We're about at that time. I'm going to run from a script because I'm not too good with improvisational talking. And my name is David Lieberman. I live here. I'm a composer. I live here in Atlanta, Georgia. We were discussing, I come from a classical music background. I played in rock and roll bands when I was in high school, and I received my doctorate at Northwestern University. I grew up in San Francisco in the 60s, which I think influenced everything about me, so that we used to run over to Golden Gate Park and hang out with hippies in the Haight-Ashbury, and so I was very influenced by Peter Max and his art, and as well the start of the Silicon Valley, growing up in San Francisco during that time. So my first computer-generated piece of music was actually about 1979, sitting in a friend's bedroom. He had an Altair computer, something like that, and I was writing note lists, and we were pumping those note lists through a tiny speaker. Although I've never really been a gamer, so I come to this as a programmer and as a composer, but not as a game player. For whatever reason, I have a hard time keeping my attention span with games. Nevertheless, the first video game that I wrote was playing around on an Apple IIe, writing a text adventure in the James Bond style type game. When I graduated school, we were discussing this a little bit. I was teaching as a teaching assistant at Northwestern. I was asked, since I had programming skills, to teach C and Unix back in the day to the computer music class. They were working on VAX Unix systems. And subsequently, I was assistant professor of electronic music and computer music at Oberlin College. I'm delighted to have accompany me today Akeem Marable on Alto Saxophone. Later on in the presentation, I'll go through, I'll go through discussing some key concepts, and then we're actually going to have Akeem play through an entire third-person shooter format type musical composition from beginning to end. Today is actually, even though the game was finished a couple of years ago, today is going to be the first entire performance in front of a group of people. So Akeem has the world premiere title attached to that tonight. I'll briefly go over a synopsis of the discussion. First, I'll point out a few elemental similarities between the human activities of playing games and performing music. And I'll look at a definition of a game from game theory and music's application to that definition, with math being obviously a strong common denominator. In section 2, we'll look briefly at some of the social trends in multimedia as a means of social interaction and expression, and how they're bringing a new social context to music performance itself. In section 3, I'll discuss the application of multimedia to music manuscript, looking briefly at historical precedents, and then at some technical considerations when applying common game types to an actual piece of music. Then in section 4A through C, we'll look at practically applying gamification or game types to musical scores. We'll look at one is a 2D arcade form, another in a text adventure form, and then we'll look at the third-person shooter format. In the third-person shooter, we'll look at the game that Akeem's going to play, Orpheus Down. And finally, we'll talk about, if we've got time at the end, the impact and implications of convergence of video games and interactive manuscript for live performance, as well as areas of future development. I apologize if I'm going to be speaking very fast. I've got a lot to go through so that we can get to the entire performance. And then I'd ask that if you can hold your questions till the very end. I appreciate that. Oops, sorry. Playing games versus performing music. When I first began looking at justifications for my work, it struck me at what fundamental levels music and games are similar. Both are essential and primary forms of entertainment, which are often done with or observed by others. Both activities require the participants' continuous involvement for the activity to proceed. Let's see, is my mouse working here? I've got a silly little graphic here that shows a guy playing a board game, and if he stops playing the game, that's it. Same thing with a piece of music. The performer stops performing the piece of music, that's it, it's done. Both advance from a point of commencement to a defined point of completion at which there's no continuation. There might be academics that can come in and point out some interesting cases where that's not the case, but in general, they both proceed and then they end. Both adhere to a strict set of predefined rules. Both make extensive use of the human facility for memory. And finally, both activities are often executed simultaneously, as in the children's game Ring Around Rosie, where a song accompanies the activity. The salient point here is the systematic and mnemonic natures of both activities is precisely what makes them appealing across all age, socioeconomic, and historical boundaries. On the right page, yes. In their book, A Course on Game Theory, Osborne and Rubinstein define a game as a description of strategic interactions that includes the constraints on the actions that the players can take and the player's interests, but does not specify the actions that the players do take. Both music and games have a set of prescribed rules and empirical formula as a foundation for those constraints on the player's action. For those in the room without musical background or have studied acoustics, all of the basic building blocks of sound, and probably everyone in here knows this, are derived from basic mathematical formula. You've got the harmonic series where most tuned vibrations, like those from a plucked string or a vibrating column of air, blowing in a Coke bottle, playing a trumpet, what have you, have predictable resonant frequencies based on the harmonic series. So you can see over here, you've got the string vibrating in its full length, and then half the length, and then a third the length. Let's see if my mouse is working. And so this is a common phenomenon anyone's heard when the players of an orchestra are tuning. Back in the day when you didn't have valves on your instruments, basically every note that that instrument, the court trumpeter, could play essentially was based on the harmonic series. Fourier theorem, any complex wave can be described as a series of component simple sine waves. Tuning systems, you've got equal temperament and just intonation. In equal temperament, there's a constant frequency multiple between any two adjacent notes. In just intonation, all notes are related by rational numbers based on the harmonic series. Amplitude as well, the measurement of amplitude has a mathematical basis in decibels, which is the logarithmic unit to express the ratio of values of two intensities. And then I think most people are familiar with Doppler shift, the change in frequency from an observer moving relative to a sound. Right there, yes. So the computer's ability to mediate elaborate rule sets and formula make it the ideal vehicle for both activities, playing games and performing music. And it's therefore possible for a computer actually simulate and win a game of chess as well as create convincing music. I don't know if anyone in here is familiar with Microsoft's Songsmith, where you actually go in and you type in a few set of parameters, and Songsmith pumps out an entire piece of music based on your parameters. Although music's foundation is in the realm of physics, it's categorized under humanities and expressive arts. And the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein in 1965, in his philosophical investigations, has a series of aphorisms. And aphorism number 21, he states, imagine a language game in which A asks and B reports the number of slabs or blocks in a pile, or the colors and shapes of the building stones that are stacked as such and such a place. Such a report might run 5 slabs. Now, what is the difference between the report and the statement 5 slabs and 5 slabs? Excuse me. So if you agree, therefore he's stating language is a game based on nuance, and if you agree therefore that the verbal language is a game based on nuance, all human interaction related to communication, including facial expression, as well is a game of interpretation. I believe, therefore, in my view, all music too, as an expressive language, is therefore a game. There are multiple venues that any performer can take in any one performance. Current studies, and I don't think anyone here would disagree, it's changed so fast recently, are that video games are now becoming a social experience with MMOs and World of Warcraft. I know my daughter at this point spends more time watching other people online playing games than she does actually playing games. In the forward to playing video games in 2006, Peter Vorderer and Jennings Bryant state playing games has become a social phenomenon. However, I don't think it's really any different than I think 200 years ago when you had a couple of guys sitting in the cafe playing dominoes and a couple other guys watching over them. I think games have always been a social phenomenon. What's different now is that TV and computers allow us to exploit the exhibitionist and voyeuristic parts of our nature. So on TV, there's this explosion of reality TV shows like Big Brother and Flavor Flav, and online the kids are modding games, blogging the details of their lives, and creating machinima for YouTube. This use of technology as a means of social interaction has positive ramifications for music performance as well. David Byrne, in a 2007 Wired magazine article, said, "In the past, music was something you heard and experienced. It was as much a social event as a purely musical one. Before recording technology existed, you could not separate music from its social context." And I think even more so back in the age of Mozart or Beethoven, where people hundreds of miles away would hear about an opera performance they just had to go to and would travel long distances, and it was an event that really marked your life. Recently, my daughter and I went to see a simulcast of Monty Python's last performance in Britain in the movie theater, and I really didn't believe the technology would pull it off, but honestly, you felt as if you were experiencing the last appearance of Monty Python, and it kind of sent tingles down your spine. If you're old enough to have sat through the early electroacoustic tape music concerts, there was always this social awkwardness because you'd go in, the audience would sit in the auditorium, there would be 2 loudspeakers, there would be a technician in the back of the room, and there would be no engagement or social experience at all. The technician would hit the play button, the music would play, the piece would finish, the lights would go up, and the audience would always, there would be this awkward moment that the audience didn't know whether they were supposed to clap or what they were supposed to do. So in current interactive technology, it's important because it's returning a sense of social context to live music making. And I really think this is evident in, someone brought up Guitar Hero and Rock Band. I think these things really brought people's attention back into this concept of group and social music making. And as a result, even though I view Guitar Hero and Rock Band as music simulations, Best Buy, if you recall, right around that time, designated a portion of their store to actual music instruments that is usually over in the video gaming department, which was a good thing. Nowadays, you have colleges who actually have laptop ensembles, as well as, I think it was Dartmouth, offered, and I don't know if they still are, but a few years back, laptop as an instrument major. So you could go there instead of taking flute, piano, saxophone, what have you. Let me check how we are on time. Good. Music's always evoked a synesthetic or multimedia response. Aristotle in 384 spoke of harmony as the union of varied color things. In the 11th century, the monks drew red and yellow staff lines to represent do and fa. Sir Isaac Newton in the 17th century noted that the relationship between prismatic rays, Roy G. Biv, and he noticed that the octave between violet and red, the color frequency of violet and red is 2 times the vibrational frequency in the same way that the octave is. Ascribed to Mozart back in the day, and I'll point it out a little bit further, is a musical dice game where the game is determined through a series of dice tosses. Several people throughout history have experimented with creating light organs that would display color that would be projected behind the audience. A lot of people in music refer to, they say when they hear the note G, for instance, it elicits a particular color in their mind when they hear it. It's been much more explored with 20th century composers, but it's almost always been limited to the printed page. So John Cage would throw yarrow sticks and then transcribe music. Maurizio Kagel would take music fragments. He's got Beethoven House. It's really an interesting early walkthrough piece. He's got a house completely plastered with fragments of Beethoven's music, and then the performer walks through he films going through the house, and then the performer watches the film and plays the music. Earl Brown, early on, had some mobile music forms. In his pieces, you would basically toss your assortment of pages, and you could start with this page or that page, or mix and match them. And Xenakis, Ioannis Xenakis had some early computer programs where he would generate an algorithm that would generate a note list, and then usually he'd have to have his students transcribe the note list to music notation. The defining point or interesting point for me here is that common Western music notation is not well adapted to multimedia, and it's not had very many major transformations or any major transformations since Gutenberg's printing press in the 1400s. So my work started somewhere around with this group of pieces. I call them the Anigraphical Etudes. In 1999, 2000, Anigraphical, I come up with the conjunction from animated, interactive, graphic, aleatoric, or algorithmic. The first piece was really when, prior to Adobe buying Flash, it was created by a small Canadian company called Macromedia, and Macromedia released it in early versions for free, and I started playing around with it, and the speed and ease within which you could do these things was quite easy, so that I was able to experiment with having actual moving notation as well as incorporating color and size and other cues. I think that's the button I pushed to get ahead. Yes, and then later on in the piece, I guess along the lines of Earl Brown, the performer lands here and makes the decision between one of these fragments, and then as well, instead of having the traditional repeat with da capo, and the performer would turn the page to get back, the performer can just click that and get to the head of the piece again. I think the standard audio symbols here, they're more for interest than for musical sake at this point. Technical implications. Clearly, one of the most appealing factors is the ability to introduce non-linearity into the music manuscript in what's traditionally been a static, fixed music event and required the performer to turn pages. Also appealing is engaging the audience at a structural and visual level, so that the structure and the form is not simply an audio logical formula to the audience that's not necessarily musically trained. I think in Beethoven, Mozart, earlier times, since those were the predominant art forms and most people learned and played the instrument and did solfege, they knew about sonata form, and they would go to the concert and eagerly await for the recapitulation or the development or what have you, where today's audiences, with schools cutting back on musical training, our ears aren't as sophisticated as they used to be, so that for an audience to hear a new piece of music, they might not grasp what the structure and the form of the music is, but they at least have this visual handle throughout the course of the game that they can grab onto and enjoy it in that way. In game terms, they're all win-win games. There's no winning or losing. Obviously, the concept of death in a musical performance doesn't work too good. The player dies or the game dies and the piece stops. So Yeah, it's a bummer. So, and winning is simply the successful completion of the musical score itself. GUI and navigational issues are similar to edutainment games, since you need to impart a certain amount of notational information to the performer. You need to fit enough musical notation on the physical display, which is definitely a challenge and affects you as a composer. Because traditionally, if you needed a larger piece of music, you could break out a larger piece of music up until the page turn, where now you need to think in smaller units. And that what you display visually has to be a sonic, meaningful, cohesive event. As well, other considerations, and I've come up with different solutions, and I think room to work on, is you've got to impart tempo to the performer, you've got to have visual cues for the performer, as well as give the performer time to turn the page, as it were. This example, I've got a 2D and arcade type format. Traditional examples would be, checking out my time, board games, casino games. The pros, I have the motivating source between the interaction is unknown, so it can cause excitement or humor. The brevity and regularity suit really a musical exercise, or once again a short humorous work. Cons would be fragmented music, restricted size of cognitive music chunks. There's tempo and page turn issues, and it's really not suited for extended musical forms. Let me get down here. So you can see here, subliminally, I've got my tempo indication here for the primary beat, and then I've got that subdivided down here along the sides. I think the instructions indicate the performer has a choice of reading traditionally right to left or diagonally. Oops. Okay. Got the idea. There. Just to show a little bit of the formula for this. Once again, this was ActionScript back in the early Flash days. I haven't played around with ActionScript lately. I don't know if this is even readable to current ActionScript guys. So just to show you structure on Mozart's musical dice game, he's got two choices by throw of dice. Bar 8 and 16, what do I have? That's right, so bar 8 and 16, you've got two choices, and then for the remaining 14 bars, you've got 11 choices. So similarly here, I've got hits 1 through 4 are the A section, 5 through 8 are the B section. You can kind of see if hit number is 5 and hit number is greater than 5 and less than 8, B section starts at measure 14 right here. So it says for my target is 1 and it's less than 9, my target plus plus. If the num hit is 5 and my target is 1, so if it's hit 5 and the target is, this space here, it forces that. Otherwise, you jump down here and everything else in between, random between 14 and 20, completely random number from 0 and 11 plus 1. So that forcing some kind of musical coherence to the piece by having the phrase begin at a set place and end at a set place, and then having these options in between. Text adventure, interactive fiction. Traditional examples, single player mud. I've got Leisure Suit Larry here. Probably a lot of people here don't know that. Pros, strong association between the visual elements and the musical fragments. The music is well adapted to branching type narratives that spin off and then come back around. The musical form is very structured like that around sonata form, coming back to the beginning. The audience is forgiving of flaws in the plot because the primary importance is the music. Cons, audience fatigue, you've got this alternation. And once again, these are all just through my experiments. If other people work through this, you're going to come up with other solutions that I did not come up with. But the con I have is the alternation between performance and narrative, performance and narrative. Let me go ahead and I'm just going to jump ahead because we're getting a little on time. So basically the performer's got this matrix. Oops. They can spin through. And let me jump ahead, third-person shooter. The piece Akeem is going to play. I'd like to get it started in a couple minutes so we make sure we've got enough time. Orpheus down. The myth of Orpheus, earliest references are a two-word fragment in 6th century BC. Orpheus traveled as an Argonaut in Jason and the Argonauts to lull the sirens so Jason's ships wouldn't get shipwrecked. He marries Eurydice. Later that night, Eurydice gets bit by a snake and dies. Overcome with grief, Orpheus travels to the underworld to get her back. He pleads with the devil. The devil says, yeah, you can get her back, but on your way back up to Earth, you can't look back at her. He goes down, he picks her up, he looks back at her, she goes down to hell forever. Honestly, I don't understand his motivation there. That's why I'm interested in the character. I can't imagine if you're so in love with the woman and you go argue with the devil that then you're going to be silly and look back. My map, I've got the upper world and the lower world. I don't really have time to go into a lot of the details I wanted to. I oftentimes use large harmonic formula to bring coherence to the piece, even though the piece is based on randomness. I think let's go ahead. There's a lot more I wanted to talk about, but let's jump ahead to the performance. Akeem? What do I need to do? I need to turn the lights off. Did you want to? Thank you so much. It's been terrific working with Akeem. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier that it's hard enough for a performer when approached with a piece of modern music, but a difficult piece of modern music, and a video game form. And Akeem didn't have. I write only for Windows machines and not Mac. And a lot of performers, and this is a dilemma. A lot of musicians and performers and artists have Macintoshes, so that's a consideration as well. Let's see how we're doing on time. We've got about 10 minutes. I did have some conclusory remarks. I'm happy to make them, but if you guys wanted to open it up for discussion, or if you had any questions for Akeem, and if there are no questions, I can make some observations. Yes.
So when you're doing these music pieces that are also supposed to have interactive elements, or however you want to balance it. Like, where do you start? Especially something as complex as that, right? Like, are you coming up with general themes that you want to express through interactivity and music? Do you come up with bits and pieces of music that you want to then experiment? Like, probably all of it, maybe? I don't.
I think it's, and you know, I'm open to anyone else that's dealt with both composition and multimedia. I think that's the age-old dilemma of how do you start a symphony?
Right.
You know?
Sure.
And that usually I find sometimes there's an awful lot of struggles in the beginning and just doodling around until you land on something that works. The challenge for me is I'm not a graphic artist. I wanted to be when I was younger. I fantasized about being a painter or what have you. So that I'm coming to this stuff without really a good eye toward that. And then as well as, and my hat's off to people that design video games in these elaborate maps, because those are really a struggle for me, how to make a meaningful map and tie it back in. So oftentimes if it's considering the story, or if it's considering starting with the music, whatever it is that can get me off and running to the next level. As all of you know, if you've done creative ventures, when you get to 3/4 of the way through, it's easy, breezy, you know? But that first part is difficult. So, yeah.
Question. Again, maybe the game isn't oriented to be a learning tool or not, but how would you address, you know, transitioning from a beginner player to being able to compete this? I see a high barrier, right, to playing this game. Is there a transition phase? Is there a feedback loop that says, hey, you did well, but not this? You mentioned not having a desire to have a win-lose or a lose scenario, but how do you, was that part of the scope of this, to include some form of transitioning someone from one level of skill to another level of skill?
It's obviously a consideration, and very early on dealing with Flash, I had started a series of educational things, and I've had, you know, last year I talked to the investment forum here, and they were all excited about it, but you know, they really wanted me to change the scope, because obviously you could make, whoever does this at an educational level is going to make a lot of money. You know, it's just that who's going to get the backing to do it. And honestly, I'm a little, if someone were to come up to me and say, hey, we want you to start this educational company and we'll pay you so many dollars, I'd say, hey, great, I'm all in. But for me as an artist, it's not worth my time changing my scope of things to tone it down for educational purposes.
Okay.
That my goal is to try to create and show that it can be done as an art form.
I appreciate it.
Did that answer that?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
But if you have millions of dollars and you want to dump into it, I'm all for it.
Got half that.
Yes.
So you have this sort of clear divide between the interaction of the game and the presentation being presented on the screen. I imagine it was a struggle to figure out exactly how that should work. Did you consider ways of like trying to integrate the notation into the gameplay window so that it wasn't one thing than the other thing, or is that a very intentional thing that you did?
No, and that question comes up commonly, and I mean it falls under the scope of things to do later. I'm already overwhelmed doing all aspects of development, and although I'm an adequate programmer, it's still a struggle. And I would love to have the audio go back into, with ADCs and DACs, go back into the game so that I could use what Akeem is playing and embed it as part of the accompaniment and incorporate DSP, but as well as for it to sample what Akeem's doing to advance the notation so he doesn't have to take his hands off of doing it. So for me now, it's just, I'm sorry, I don't have the chops to, and the latency timing issues would be huge with bringing in the audio. If someone, once again, in here is a programmer and has those skills, I'd love to talk to you, but so I basically have to accommodate musically for the performer taking their hands off and going back in so that the structure of the piece isn't broken up and bifurcated.
So, what initiated the transition? Who initiated the transitions from between the video segment. And are those movements fixed, or is that, in other words, where Orpheus is wandering around, is that different each time, or?
Yeah, every time, theoretically, every time the piece is played is completely different.
So, in other words, the video is reacting?
No, the video is fixed. Those are standard, I think gamers refer to them as cutscenes, is that correct?
Okay,
there
so
are
that
a
is
few.
sequential, and it's always going to be the same.
It's always going to be the same, and the music is fixed within that video. And then that's also the challenge, is integrating it into the video in and out of the gameplay.
So the interaction is simply the transition between the sections that you had to play and going into the video.
Well, the video, there's how many video segments? There's the intro video. There's a very brief video when the conga drum is thrown across the room. There's the video when the red box floats up with the bubbles. And there's the video when he looks back.
Right.
But other than that, every other element is squishy and movable. There is.
What's the trigger?
Well, if you notice, there's the little square panel showing this is your next goal.
So you hit that on your computer screen.
So the goal says now you're looking for a saxophone. So Akeem goes and looks for a saxophone. The goal says go to the open door, and Akeem goes to the open door. Now, in between here and here, he can really go wherever he wants, and that's the challenge as any composer in video game music, making it so that the music is dynamic and.
Well, I guess my question is what triggers you get to the end of that note? Is it perceived? Is it an ABC, or is it a button on the computer screen on the score?
So when the score is playing, and he's done.
And when you're playing, then how do you say, okay, all right, so you reach the last note in that little segment of your part.
Oh, then yeah, you just hit enter.
Okay, so it's okay. So I'm just trying to get the degree of actual interaction.
Right. So I mean, if the performer were to fall asleep at that point and forget to hit enter, it would break up the music.
But the musical performance is not changing the sequence of video objects afterwards.
He is.
Right.
If he hits that saxophone or that saxophone, but then all of the accompaniment is algorithmically derived based on probability and statistics and what goals have been accomplished and where the piece it is. So that's where I'm saying the piece is completely different every time, although the algorithmic structure is so precise that most audience members would never notice it. There's about 200 sound files.
So that notation that is being played back on the computer is different each time?
I'm confused when you say notation. Do you mean his sax
Right,
part?
no, I'm talking about like the percussion and various other instruments.
That's all algorithmically generated. They're basically small wave file fragments, and the code says if the probability is 70% and you're at this portion of the piece and you've hit the conga drum, then you can randomly pick between these elements.
Okay, so that means you might get a different music.
Every time it's played is completely different.
Okay, so the video is fixed, but the music performance is what's changed.
The video's fixed. His score fragments, he's got some flexibility. He can pick that one or that one and change up the score fragments, but then everything else is not fixed.
Okay.
Did that answer?
Yeah. So in other words, it's not straight. In other words, the audio portion is not necessarily ingrained in the video.
The video, the audio is ingrained, but you mean the video in the game playing portions, the audio is completely flexible and determined by algorithm.
So in other words, when Orpheus goes into that elevator,
right?
If you played it again, it might be different music.
Well, you're confusing me here because the elevator portion where he's sliding down, the tube, that is a video cutscene, so the audio is fixed. But then when he lands in the room and is looking around and going to the saxophone, that's gameplay completely algorithmically derived. Did we get that? Okay. Yes.
So I have a question for you: is the playing the piece, like how does you're switching between looking at the music and performing that, and then also interacting with it. So how does, I mean, I don't really have a real question, like how does one color the other? Like how does it, as a performer, how does that change your relationship to the
Typically, for me, performance-wise, usually playing jazz, so I don't usually use any written music at all. So just engage in a totally different way. So one, reading music, which I've gone to school for many years, comfortable doing that. But back and forth with the game definitely makes me a little anxious. So it's like kind of like for me playing, it's like kind of on edge. Looking around like this, much more so than if I'm just looking at a black music stand, music on it, or just looking at something I've done time and time again.
And were you seeing what we were seeing while you were
Yeah.
Very nice performance.
Yes.
how many times have you been through that?
4 or 5 times.
Wow. That was a tough
Remarks.
failure.
Your site is
No.
Oh.
I mean,
like practice you put together. You played them before.
yeah.
But that's the implication.
Right, because essentially
Because-
you're gonna have to.
I provided him with as many tools as I could to prepare him. So I think I gave him a video take of the entire game.
Yes.
I provided him with audio of the sax part. I provided him with folio pages of the music that's presented to him so that he can get as comfortable as possible. But the implication of this in the future, and a lot of classical music circles are talking about this, that I think the performer of tomorrow is going to have to be an exceptional sight reader.
Yeah.
Because if you're creating music by algorithm, the next step is not to have me transcribe the notation in there, but that's something I would like to do in the future, have the notation automatically generated on the screen, and then Akeem essentially is in a sight reading situation.
But the score that you were, the part that you're performing, is it the same every time, or is it different?
Yeah.
It's the same.
But he chooses the order in which they often arrive within the score.
So you're able to rehearse it, but it may not be at the same time sequence.
Which is why I was saying it's kind of like sight reading because you have your parts that you know, but they're in a different order. So you still have to transition. When you learn the music, you want to learn segment by segment anyway, and then play it all back from in a linear fashion. But that's pretty neat.
We got a couple of other questions I want to get to because we're out of time.
Well, my main concern was how did you keep time while you were doing it? Because I was trying to watch the music as you were playing, and I could not keep up with you at all.
Without anytime you play solo, if we're seeing a marching band, so you got the drum major up front, and they're like keeping tempo visually. If there's no drum beat behind, wind sound. Because when I blow a note, it's like it can start here or it can start just here. So if you're thinking of the tempo as here, and I'm thinking of it here, immediately behind or in front of you, then they're gonna stay together, but they're still different. So they can stick together, but
It will follow you fairly well, not much of a music record. You can tell from the signature of sequences.
So I guess to kind of wrap up and completely answer your question, in my opinion, as a musician and a teacher, working with students who literally struggle with this, without like a drum pattern, marking, where 1 is, or 2, or 3, or 4, then it's not very clear when you're just using a single wind sound. But if you added maybe 10 saxophones or some other instruments playing different parts, then the connectedness or interconnectedness of the parts are going to make it a lot more obvious than when there's a single instrument.
Then you're going to get it enough.
But as a composer, it's part of my challenge too, so that he doesn't get completely lost. And if you notice in the score, there's one of them where I build in audio cues of a hi-hat being hit, and then I physically draw a blue arrow down to the note. You caught that. So that, I have to consider these things within the score, otherwise the player could conceptually get completely lost. There was another question back here. Okay.
I have an answer.
I think we're officially done. Unless there's more questions, thank you very much. I'm so pleased you guys came.